How North Korea became nuclear. North Korea is one of the most isolated countries on Earth, yet it possesses some of the most powerful weapons ever created by mankind. Today, it is a nuclear-armed state capable of launching ballistic missiles that can travel thousands of kilometers. But how did a small, impoverished country, devastated by war and largely cut off from the world, manage to build nuclear weapons? The answer is not found in a single event. It is a story that spans more than a century and begins long before North Korea itself even existed. To understand how North Korea became nuclear, we must first understand the history of Korea. For centuries, Korea existed as a single nation. That changed in 1910 when Japan formally annexed the Korean peninsula and incorporated it into the Japanese Empire. For the next 35 years, Korea was ruled by Japan. During this period, Korean political institutions were dismantled, resources were extracted for Japan's benefit, and many Koreans resisted foreign rule. Among those who opposed Japanese occupation was a young guerrilla fighter named Kim Il-sung. Although historians continue to debate the exact scale of his military achievements, there is little doubt that his participation in anti-Japanese resistance became the foundation of his future political legitimacy. Everything changed in August of 1945. As World War II drew to a close, the United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Facing overwhelming destruction, Japan surrendered. Its empire collapsed almost overnight, and Korea was finally liberated. But liberation created a new problem. Who would govern Korea? As Japanese authority disappeared, Soviet forces moved into northern Korea while American forces entered the south. Neither side expected the division to become permanent. In fact, the boundary separating the two occupation zones was chosen hastily along the 38th parallel. It was intended as a temporary administrative measure until a unified Korean government could be established. However, the world was entering the Cold War. Relations between the United States and the Soviet Union deteriorated rapidly. As tensions grew, cooperation over Korea became increasingly difficult. Instead of reunification, two separate governments emerged. In 1948, Kim Il-sung became leader of the newly established Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north. In the south, Syngman Rhee became president of the Republic of Korea. Neither government accepted the legitimacy of the other. Both claimed to represent all Koreans. Both believed the division of the peninsula was temporary. And both hoped, eventually, to reunify Korea under their own rule. These competing visions would soon lead to one of the most devastating wars of the 20th century. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and launched a full-scale invasion of South Korea. The attack was supported by Soviet equipment and came after months of discussions between Kim Il-sung and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. Kim believed the war would be quick. He expected South Korea to collapse rapidly and believed the United States might choose not to intervene. At first, events appeared to support his assumptions. North Korean troops advanced rapidly and captured Seoul, the South Korean capital, within days. South Korean forces retreated southward, and United Nations troops struggled to halt the offensive. By the late summer of 1950, South Korean and United Nations forces had been pushed into a small defensive area around the southeastern city of Busan. It seemed possible that North Korea might win the war. Then everything changed. In September 1950, General Douglas MacArthur launched a daring amphibious assault at the port city of Incheon. The operation caught North Korean forces by surprise and severed their supply lines. Suddenly, the momentum of the war reversed. United Nations forces pushed northward, recaptured Seoul, and crossed into North Korea itself. The objective was no longer simply defending South Korea. The goal had become the defeat of the North Korean regime. As United Nations forces approached the Yalu River, which forms the border between North Korea and China, alarm spread through the Chinese leadership. Mao Zedong feared that hostile forces stationed directly on China's frontier would pose a long-term security threat. China warned that it would intervene if the advance continued. The warnings were largely ignored. In October 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops entered the war. Their arrival transformed the conflict once again. United Nations forces were pushed back, Seoul changed hands multiple times, and the war descended into a brutal stalemate. For the next several years, neither side achieved a decisive victory. Meanwhile, North Korea suffered enormous destruction. American aircraft enjoyed overwhelming control of the skies and conducted extensive bombing campaigns against transportation networks, industrial facilities, military targets, and infrastructure. Many North Korean cities were heavily damaged during the conflict. The experience left a lasting impression on North Korean leaders. They had witnessed their country nearly destroyed. They had depended on foreign allies for survival, and they had faced an enemy possessing immense military superiority. Even more importantly, North Korean leaders knew that the United States possessed nuclear weapons. Even more importantly, North Korean leaders knew that the United States possessed nuclear weapons. During the war, American military and political leaders discussed various escalation options, including scenarios involving nuclear weapons. Although no nuclear weapons were ultimately used, the possibility itself became deeply significant in North Korean strategic thinking. To the leadership in Pyongyang, the lesson seemed clear. A weak nation could be invaded. A weak nation could be bombed. A weak nation could become dependent on others for survival. But a nation possessing overwhelming military deterrence might avoid such vulnerability. On July 27, 1953, an armistice agreement brought active fighting to an end. However, the war did not officially end. No peace treaty was ever signed. Technically, North and South Korea remain in a state of war to this day. For North Korea, the Korean War became more than a historical event. It became the foundation of an entire worldview. And from that worldview would eventually emerge one of the most controversial nuclear programs in modern history. Following the Korean War, North Korea faced a reality that would shape its future for decades. Much of the country had been devastated. Cities, factories, transportation networks, and infrastructure had been heavily damaged. The war had also demonstrated something else. North Korea could not survive alone. Without Chinese intervention, the regime might have collapsed. Without Soviet assistance, reconstruction would have been far more difficult. For Kim Il-sung, rebuilding the country was only one priority. Ensuring that the events of the Korean War could never be repeated was equally important. In the years after 1953, North Korea relied heavily on aid from both the Soviet Union and China. These two communist powers helped finance reconstruction, provided industrial equipment, and supported the rebuilding of the economy. Yet even while accepting their assistance, Kim Il-sung sought to reduce dependence on foreign powers. This desire eventually evolved into an ideology known as Juche, often translated as self-reliance. The principle of Juche held that North Korea should be politically independent, economically self-sufficient, and capable of defending itself without relying excessively on outside powers. While reality often forced North Korea to depend on foreign assistance, the idea of self-reliance became central to government policy and national identity. At the same time, the Cold War was intensifying. The world had become divided into competing blocs led by the United States and the Soviet Union. Nuclear weapons increasingly dominated international security. By the 1960s, the United States and Soviet Union possessed thousands of nuclear warheads. In 1964, neighboring China successfully tested its first nuclear weapon and became the world's fifth nuclear power. From North Korea's perspective, nuclear weapons appeared to be becoming the ultimate symbol of military power. Yet North Korea was still far from possessing such capabilities. The country's initial interest in nuclear technology was focused on scientific research and energy development. During the 1950s and 1960s, North Korean scientists received training in the Soviet Union. Educational exchanges allowed researchers to study nuclear science, reactor technology, and related engineering disciplines. These programs were conducted openly and were not unusual during the period. Many countries sought peaceful nuclear expertise, and the Soviet Union routinely assisted allied states. One of the most important outcomes of this cooperation was the development of nuclear research facilities at Yongbyon, a location that would later become synonymous with North Korea's nuclear program. At first, Yongbyon was not a weapons production site. It was a research center. Scientists conducted experiments, studied reactor operations, and developed technical expertise. However, nuclear technology has always presented a unique challenge for the international community. Many of the technologies required for peaceful nuclear energy can also contribute to the development of nuclear weapons. A reactor designed for research can produce scientific knowledge. But under certain conditions, reactors can also produce materials that may eventually be used in weapons programs. This dual-use nature of nuclear technology would become one of the defining issues of North Korea's future. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, North Korea gradually expanded its nuclear infrastructure. New facilities were constructed, technical expertise improved, and Yongbyon grew into the country's primary nuclear complex. At this stage, direct evidence that North Korea had made a formal decision to build nuclear weapons remains limited. Historians continue to debate exactly when the leadership shifted from pursuing nuclear research to pursuing a military nuclear capability. What is clear is that by the late 1970s and early 1980s, North Korea was developing facilities that could potentially support weapons production. To understand why this mattered, it is necessary to understand a crucial scientific concept. Nuclear weapons require fissile material. The two most common materials are highly enriched uranium and plutonium. Plutonium does not occur naturally in useful quantities. Instead, it is produced inside certain types of nuclear reactors as uranium fuel is irradiated over time. If spent nuclear fuel is later chemically processed, plutonium can be separated and extracted. This process is known as reprocessing. A country capable of operating reactors and reprocessing spent fuel may eventually acquire enough plutonium for nuclear weapons. Because of this, intelligence agencies around the world began paying increasing attention to North Korea's activities. Throughout the 1980s, foreign governments monitored developments at Yongbyon with growing concern. Satellite imagery revealed expanding facilities. Analysts observed construction projects that appeared consistent with plutonium production capabilities. North Korea maintained that its nuclear activities were peaceful and intended for scientific and energy purposes. Many outside observers remained skeptical. The issue became even more significant in 1985 when North Korea joined the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, commonly known as the NPT. The treaty represented one of the most important international agreements governing nuclear technology. Under its terms, countries without nuclear weapons agreed not to acquire them. In return, they were permitted access to peaceful nuclear technology under international safeguards and inspections. By joining the treaty, North Korea formally committed itself not to pursue nuclear weapons. For a time, this appeared to be a positive development. However, questions soon began to emerge. As the Cold War approached its final years, international inspectors sought greater transparency regarding North Korea's nuclear activities. Information provided by Pyongyang did not always match external assessments. Discrepancies began appearing in estimates of plutonium production and reactor operations. The differences might have been innocent. They might have reflected technical misunderstandings, or they might have indicated undeclared nuclear activities. No one knew for certain. What was clear was that suspicion was growing. Then, in 1991, an event occurred that transformed North Korea's strategic environment almost overnight. The Soviet Union collapsed. For decades, the Soviet Union had been North Korea's most important economic and military partner. Its sudden disappearance created enormous uncertainty. North Korea lost a major source of aid, trade, and diplomatic support. The world was changing rapidly. Communist governments across Eastern Europe were falling. The Cold War was ending. And for the first time since its creation, North Korea faced a future in which its most powerful ally no longer existed. The timing could hardly have been worse. As the Soviet Union disappeared, questions about North Korea's nuclear activities were becoming more serious than ever. The stage was now set for the first major nuclear crisis on the Korean peninsula. And in the years ahead, North Korea's relationship with the international community would become increasingly confrontational, bringing the world closer to conflict than many people realized at the time. By the early 1990s, North Korea found itself in one of the most difficult situations in its history. The Cold War was over. The Soviet Union had collapsed. Communist governments across Eastern Europe had fallen. Around the world, many observers wondered whether North Korea might be next. For the leadership in Pyongyang, these developments were deeply concerning. The country was facing economic difficulties, diplomatic isolation, and growing uncertainty about its future. At the same time, international attention was becoming increasingly focused on North Korea's nuclear activities. The center of the controversy remained Yongbyon. Inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, were tasked with verifying that North Korea's nuclear program remained peaceful and complied with its obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. As inspections progressed, questions began to emerge. Information provided by North Korea appeared inconsistent with evidence collected by inspectors. One major issue involved plutonium. Based on samples and technical analysis, inspectors suspected that North Korea may have separated more plutonium than it had officially declared. The exact amount became a matter of intense dispute. North Korea rejected accusations that it was pursuing nuclear weapons. The international community remained unconvinced. As tensions increased, the crisis rapidly escalated.
Comrades, the hostile forces conspire against our republic. Their sanctions will shatter like wave. We turn from empty gestures toward the radiant path of Juche.
The treaty had been designed to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. If North Korea withdrew and continued developing nuclear technology without international oversight, many feared it could eventually produce nuclear weapons. Diplomatic efforts intensified. Negotiations continued. Yet the situation remained unstable. By 1994, the crisis had become so serious that military conflict was openly discussed by policymakers in Washington. The possibility of military strikes against North Korean nuclear facilities entered strategic planning discussions. Such strikes carried enormous risks. Military analysts warned that any attack could trigger a Second Korean War. Millions of civilians lived within range of North Korean artillery positioned near the demilitarized zone. A renewed conflict could rapidly become catastrophic. As tensions mounted, an unexpected diplomatic breakthrough occurred. Former United States President Jimmy Carter traveled to North Korea and met directly with Kim Il-sung. The visit helped reduce immediate tensions and opened the door for negotiations between Washington and Pyongyang. The result was an agreement known as the Agreed Framework. Signed in October 1994, the agreement represented one of the most ambitious attempts to resolve the nuclear dispute peacefully. Under the terms of the agreement, North Korea would freeze operations at key nuclear facilities associated with plutonium production. In exchange, an international consortium would help provide alternative nuclear reactors that were considered less suitable for weapons production. North Korea would also receive energy assistance while the new reactors were being built. At the time, many observers believed a major crisis had been averted. The immediate danger of war declined. North Korea froze significant portions of its plutonium program. For several years, the agreement appeared to stabilize the situation. Then, just months after the agreement was signed, a major event changed the course of North Korean history. In July 1994, Kim Il-sung died. He had ruled North Korea since its founding. His death raised questions about the future of the regime. Power eventually passed to his son, Kim Jong-il. Unlike many political transitions, this succession had been carefully prepared over many years. Even so, Kim Jong-il inherited a country facing severe challenges. The economic situation continued to deteriorate. Then disaster struck. During the mid-1990s, North Korea experienced a devastating famine. A combination of factors contributed to the crisis. Natural disasters damaged agricultural production. Economic inefficiencies reduced productivity. The loss of Soviet support further weakened the economy. The exact death toll remains uncertain because reliable data is difficult to obtain. Estimates vary widely, with many scholars concluding that hundreds of thousands of people died, while some estimates suggest even higher numbers. The famine became one of the greatest humanitarian disasters in modern East Asian history. While North Korea struggled internally, problems with the agreed framework continued to grow. Implementation moved slowly. Political opposition emerged in both countries. Delays affected reactor construction. Mutual distrust deepened. Each side increasingly accused the other of failing to fulfill its commitments. By the early 2000s, the agreement was under severe strain. Then a new controversy emerged. American officials accused North Korea of pursuing a uranium enrichment program. This accusation was significant because the agreed framework had primarily focused on plutonium production. A uranium program would provide an alternative route toward nuclear weapons. Exactly what was said during discussions between American and North Korean officials remains disputed. Historians continue to debate aspects of the diplomatic exchanges that followed. What is not disputed is that the disagreement severely damaged relations. The agreed framework rapidly unraveled. International inspectors were expelled. Monitoring equipment was removed. The freeze on nuclear facilities collapsed. Then, in January 2003, North Korea took a dramatic step. It announced its withdrawal from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This decision fundamentally changed the situation. For years, concerns had focused on whether North Korea might be secretly pursuing nuclear weapons. Now the country was openly rejecting one of the central pillars of the global non-proliferation system. The international community responded with alarm. Yet diplomacy had not completely ended. A new negotiation process soon emerged. China organized talks involving 6 countries: North Korea, South Korea, China, Japan, Russia, and the United States. These negotiations became known as the Six-Party Talks. The objective was ambitious. North Korea would abandon its nuclear ambitions. In return, it could receive economic assistance, security guarantees, and improved diplomatic relations. Negotiations continued for years. At times, progress appeared possible. At other times, discussions stalled. Agreements were reached. Then disagreements emerged over implementation. The cycle repeated again and again. Meanwhile, North Korea continued advancing its nuclear capabilities. Then came the moment that changed everything. On October 9, 2006, seismic monitoring stations detected an unusual event inside North Korea. The government soon announced that it had successfully conducted a nuclear test. For decades, the world had debated North Korea's intentions. Now the debate was over. North Korea had crossed the nuclear threshold. The first test was relatively small compared to the arsenals possessed by major nuclear powers. Nevertheless, its significance was enormous. North Korea had become the first country to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and then successfully test a nuclear weapon. The international reaction was swift. Governments condemned the test. The United Nations imposed sanctions. Diplomatic pressure intensified. Yet despite these measures, North Korea's nuclear journey was far from over. The first test did not mark the end of the program. It marked the beginning of a new phase. North Korea no longer sought merely to demonstrate that it could build a bomb. Its next objective would be transforming a single nuclear device into a credible nuclear arsenal. And over the following years, that is exactly what it attempted to do. North Korea's first nuclear test in October 2006 changed the strategic landscape of East Asia. For decades, governments had debated whether North Korea intended to build nuclear weapons. After the test, that question no longer mattered. The world now faced a different question. How large and how capable could North Korea's nuclear arsenal become? At first, many analysts believed North Korea's progress would remain limited. The first nuclear test appeared relatively small. Questions remained about the reliability of North Korean designs. Some experts doubted whether the country could successfully miniaturize nuclear warheads for use on ballistic missiles. Others believed sanctions and international pressure would eventually force North Korea back to the negotiating table. What followed surprised many observers. Instead of slowing down, North Korea accelerated its efforts. In the years after 2006, the country conducted additional nuclear tests and expanded its missile development programs. Each test provided scientists with new data and valuable experience. Although the outside world could not directly observe every aspect of the program, the pattern suggested continuous improvement. At the same time, North Korea invested heavily in ballistic missile technology. Building a nuclear weapon is only part of the challenge. A country must also develop reliable methods of delivering that weapon to a target. This requires missiles capable of carrying warheads over long distances. North Korea began testing increasingly sophisticated missile systems. Some failed spectacularly, others succeeded. Each success moved the country closer to possessing a credible nuclear deterrent. Meanwhile, a major political transition was taking place. In December 2011, Kim Jong-il died after ruling North Korea for nearly 17 years. Leadership passed to his youngest son, Kim Jong-un. Many foreign observers initially questioned whether the young and relatively inexperienced leader could maintain control of the country. Those doubts proved short-lived. Kim Jong-un consolidated power rapidly and demonstrated a strong commitment to advancing both the nuclear and missile programs. Under his leadership, testing activity increased significantly. The pace of development accelerated. The world witnessed a series of increasingly ambitious missile launches. Some missiles demonstrated ranges capable of reaching targets far beyond the Korean peninsula. Others suggested progress toward intercontinental ballistic missile technology. An intercontinental ballistic missile, often called an ICBM, is a missile capable of traveling thousands of kilometers and potentially delivering a nuclear warhead across continents. For decades, North Korea's ability to develop such weapons had been uncertain. Now it appeared increasingly plausible. The international community responded with growing concern. The United Nations imposed additional sanctions. These measures targeted trade, financial transactions, exports, imports, and other sectors of the North Korean economy. The goal was straightforward. By increasing economic pressure, governments hoped to persuade North Korea to abandon its nuclear ambitions. However, North Korea continued to prioritize its weapons programs despite mounting economic costs. For the leadership in Pyongyang, the nuclear program was increasingly portrayed as essential to national security. Then came another major milestone. In 2016 and 2017, North Korea conducted additional nuclear tests, including one that it claimed was a thermonuclear weapon, commonly known as a hydrogen bomb. Hydrogen bombs are significantly more powerful than the atomic bombs used during World War II. Independent experts continue to debate certain technical aspects of North Korea's claims, but most analysts agree that the country's nuclear capabilities advanced substantially during this period. At the same time, missile testing reached unprecedented levels. Several launches demonstrated ranges suggesting that parts of the continental United States could potentially be reached. This represented a dramatic shift in global security calculations. For the first time, North Korea appeared capable of threatening targets thousands of kilometers away with nuclear-armed missiles. Tensions rose sharply. In 2017, rhetoric between North Korea and the United States became increasingly hostile. Some commentators openly discussed the possibility of military conflict. The situation appeared particularly dangerous because both sides sought to demonstrate resolve while avoiding actions that could trigger war. Then, unexpectedly, the atmosphere began to change. In 2018, a remarkable diplomatic opening emerged. Kim Jong-un met South Korean President Moon Jae-in in a series of historic summits. Images of the two leaders crossing the demilitarized zone captured global attention. Shortly afterward, an even more extraordinary meeting took place. For the first time in history, a sitting president of the United States met directly with a North Korean leader. President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un held a summit in Singapore. The meeting generated enormous international interest. Supporters hoped it might lead to a breakthrough. Critics remained skeptical. The discussions produced broad statements regarding peace and denuclearization, but many critical details remained unresolved. Additional meetings followed, including a summit in Hanoi in 2019. However, negotiations eventually stalled. The fundamental problem proved difficult to overcome. The United States sought meaningful steps toward denuclearization. North Korea sought sanctions relief and security guarantees. Neither side was willing to make concessions sufficient to satisfy the other. As a result, diplomacy gradually lost momentum. By the early 2020s, North Korea had resumed significant weapons testing activity. Missile launches continued. Military capabilities expanded. Evidence suggested ongoing nuclear development. Despite decades of sanctions, negotiations, agreements, and diplomatic initiatives, North Korea remained a nuclear-armed state. This raises an important question. Did North Korea achieve its objectives? The answer depends on which objective is being considered. If the primary goal was regime survival, many analysts would argue that the program succeeded. The government remains in power. No foreign military intervention has occurred. North Korea commands international attention disproportionate to its economic size. Its leadership has secured a level of deterrence that few countries possess. On the other hand, the costs have been significant. The country faces extensive international sanctions. Economic development has been constrained. Relations with many nations remain limited. The nuclear program has contributed to decades of diplomatic isolation. This creates one of the central paradoxes of modern North Korean history. The same weapons that may have strengthened the regime's security have also contributed to its isolation from much of the world. Looking back across more than a century of history, it becomes clear that North Korea's nuclear program did not emerge from a single decision or a single event. Its roots stretch back to Japanese colonial rule. They extend through the division of Korea at the end of World War II. They are deeply connected to the devastation of the Korean War and the security fears that followed. They involve decades of Cold War rivalry, Soviet assistance, Chinese support, scientific development, diplomatic confrontation, and strategic calculation. Whether one views North Korea's nuclear program as a defensive necessity, a dangerous threat, or something in between, understanding its origins requires understanding this entire historical chain. The story of how North Korea became nuclear is ultimately a story about fear, survival, power, and the belief that in a world dominated by stronger nations, possessing the most destructive weapons ever created might be the only way to ensure that your regime endures. And that belief continues to shape the Korean Peninsula and international politics to this day.